Chapter 9 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 7, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 9. Gettysburg. General Meade assumed command of the Army of the Potomac in an order which was equally free from humility and bluster. "It is with just diffidence," he said, "that I relieve in the command of this army an eminent and accomplished soldier whose name must ever appear conspicuous in the history of its achievements, but I rely upon the hearty support of my companions in arms to assist me in the discharge of the duties of the most important trust which has been confided to me." To General Halleck he simply acknowledged the receipt of the order placing him in command. "As a soldier, I obey it," he said, "and to the utmost of my ability will execute it." He very briefly announced his general intention to be to move toward Susquehanna, keeping Washington and Baltimore well covered, and if the enemy is checked in his attempt to cross the Susquehanna, or if he turns towards Baltimore, to give him battle. He asked permission, not, as Hooker did, to abandon Harper's Ferry, but to withdraw a portion of its garrison, leaving enough to hold Maryland Heights against a coup de main. In this shape the request met with more favorable consideration from the General-in-Chief, and he left the disposition to be made of the garrison to Meade's discretion. The new general made no change in the administration of his army. He retained, for the time being, General Hooker's staff. He asked that 3 meritorious young captains of cavalry, Farnsworth, Custer, and Merritt, all recommended by General Pleasonton, and 2 of them doomed to the death of soldiers in the flower of their youth, should be made brigadier generals, which was at once done. The authorities at Washington placed all their resources freely in his hands. He had nothing to do but go forward and find and fight the enemy. He had, on his part, no desire to do anything else. On the 29th he placed his army in motion for the north, with a front stretching across 30 miles of country, his cavalry guarding his flanks and rear. His intention remained the same as that of the day before. If Lee moved for Baltimore, to get between his main army and that place. If he should attempt to cross the Susquehanna, Meade relied upon General Couch, with his force, to hold him until the Army of the Potomac could fall upon his rear. With this general plan he moved steadily northward as rapidly as possible, his corps spreading out like a fan upon the diverging roads, keeping them well in hand, so that they might rapidly concentrate, whenever necessary, to meet an attack of the enemy or fall upon any detached portion of his force which they might encounter. It was not until the evening of the 28th, while preparing to march upon Harrisburg, that General Lee became aware that the Army of the Potomac had crossed into Maryland. By detaching his cavalry in every direction he had deprived himself of his usual means of information. Stuart was far to the east on a useless chase. Imboden, in the west, had been busily engaged in breaking up the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and damaging, as far as possible, the Chesapeake Canal, and now, although ordered to join the army by way of McConnellsburg, was still entirely out of reach. It was only through a scout that the Confederate general learned that the Federal army was advancing northward, and that the head of the column was menacing his communications with the Potomac. Even this news, when it reached him, was more than 24 hours old, and when he resolved to concentrate his army on the east side of the mountains for the purpose of diverting the supposed westward Federal movement, that movement had been already abandoned, and Meade was moving with the greatest rapidity in the very direction which Lee desired to have him take. While Longstreet and Hill, in pursuance of Lee's orders, were marching east through the mountains to Gettysburg, while Early was hastening back from York to join Ewell, and the latter was leading his corps from Carlisle to the general rendezvous, General Meade was pushing his entire army in a direction almost perpendicular to the Confederate line of march. Each general, while maneuvering with boldness and energy, was determined, when the time for actual battle should come, to accept only a tactical defensive attitude. Lee had given a positive promise to his corps commanders that he would not attack the Army of the Potomac, nor accept its gage of battle unless under favorable conditions. General Meade, after his victory, frankly stated that it was his desire to receive the attack of the enemy and fight a defensive rather than an offensive battle, being satisfied that such a course offered the better chance of success. But, in spite of these prudent intentions upon both sides, these two formidable armies were approaching each other at their utmost speed all through the day of the 30th of June, driven by the irresistible laws of human action, or, let us reverently say, by the hand of Providence, as unconscious of their point of meeting as two great thunderclouds, big with incalculable lightnings, lashed across the skies by tempestuous winds. On the evening of the 30th, Meade's army, still kept well in hand, had advanced until his left wing, the First Corps, had crossed the Pennsylvania line, resting at Marsh Creek, a few miles south of Gettysburg. The extreme right, the Sixth Corps, was at Manchester in Maryland, over 30 miles away. The 11th Corps was at Emmitsburg, where the 3rd arrived in the night, the 2nd at Uniontown, the 5th at Union Mills, and the 12th at Littlestown. General Meade was by this time convinced that the enemy was aware of his movement, that he had loosed his hold upon the Susquehanna, and was drawing in all his detachments to the main body for a movement in force upon some other point. He did not know precisely when or where the blow would fall, but he determined that if possible he would receive the onslaught of the enemy on ground chosen by himself, where he might fight a defensive battle with every attainable advantage. Meade therefore sent out to all his corps commanders on the night of the 30th of June, after midnight, for the order is dated on the 1st of July, a circular informing them that Harrisburg was relieved, and that the prospect of an invasion of Pennsylvania beyond the Susquehanna was at an end. He accordingly announced his intention to withdraw the army from its present position, and to form a line of battle, with the left resting in the neighborhood of Middleburg, and the right at Manchester, the general direction being along Pipe Creek. He followed this with specific directions as to the course to be taken by each one of the corps. This choice of Pipe Creek as a line for defensive battle had been made after careful surveys by members of the Engineer Corps. The army was in such position on the morning of the 1st that this concentration could have been easily and rapidly made. The objection to it was obvious. The soldiers who were marching towards the enemy in high spirits and eager to meet him could not but suffer a certain loss of morale in this sudden change to a retrograde movement. But the advantages of the line he had selected were, in the general's opinion, a sufficient compensation. The wisdom of this purpose of General Meade's will doubtless be a subject of curious discussion among military men for many years to come. If the order had been given a few hours earlier, or if the army of Lee, marching through the defiles of the mountain, had been more expeditious, the waters of the peaceful rivulet, which Meade had selected for his line of battle, would have reflected that evening the blaze of thousands of campfires, and the hills upon its border would have been lifted with the dawn of the next day into the most luminous blaze of flame. But this baleful glory was not reserved for Pipe Creek. The little town of Gettysburg, which, while that order of Meade's was written, lay sleeping in quiet obscurity among the hills of Pennsylvania, was destined to the terrors and the honors of the greatest battlefield of the New World. Thus, while Meade was sending his advance to occupy Gettysburg, it was with no thought of fighting there. It seemed to him merely a point from which to observe and occupy the enemy's advance, and to mask his own movement to what seemed to him a better line in the rear. To Lee, although he did not expect to find his enemy there, the place was of far more importance. It was not only almost equidistant from Chambersburg, Carlisle, and York, and for that reason the most convenient point for the concentration of his scattered army, but it was the center of all the important roads of the region, which radiated from it on every side like the spokes from a hub. The possession of it was necessary to give him freedom of decision and of action in advancing to the east, or retreating to the west or south. Gettysburg lies in a peaceful pastoral region, the county seat of Adams County. 10 miles on the west, the blue wall of the South Mountain Range closes the view, while the entire landscape is wrinkled by parallel lines of lower ranges of hills. A little more than a mile west of the town, two of these ridges are separated by a fertile valley, through which a brook meanders called Willoughby's Run. It is crossed by the diverging lines of the Chambersburg and Hagerstown roads, the former inclining to the north, the latter to the south. The range of wooded hills between the brook and the town, running almost unbroken for several miles north and south, is called Oak Hill to the north of these roads, and Seminary Ridge to the south, the latter name being given from a Lutheran seminary which occupies a gentle acclivity between the roads not far from the point where they meet and enter the town. Due south of Gettysburg, on a hill between the Baltimore and Taneytown roads, is a cemetery where the forefathers of the hamlet sleep. The range begins in a rocky cliff called Culp's Hill, which, rising above the winding stream of Rock Creek, east of the town, runs north and west, presenting a bold front to the town for 1,000 yards, and is prolonged in a southerly direction for about 3 miles, ending abruptly in a bold conical rock called Round Top, which dominates the country for leagues around. On the northern slope of this tower-like hill is a smaller spur of the same character called Little Round Top. The range runs parallel to Seminary Ridge, which lies 1.5 miles to the west. Between them is a highly cultivated valley filled with grain fields and orchards, dotted with thrifty Pennsylvania farmhouses and barns. In the midst of this valley there is a lower intermediate ridge, along which runs the road to Emmitsburg. No soldier could look at this range of hills without recognizing its remarkable advantages for a great defensive battle. It was a Cyclopean fortress, framed for its purpose before the birth of man. At its northern extremity, the curve to the east and south, crowned by the salient of Culp's Hill, guarded that flank. Round Tops formed a redoubtable bastion on the south, and between them the hill was battlemented with a chaos of boulders. The Taneytown road wound just below the crest, and the Baltimore road, at the foot of the eastern slope, afforded a perfect service of transportation for the defense, and in front, the gentle slope and the cultivated fields furnished, as Hooker would have said, elbow room for fighting, such as neither army had as yet ever beheld. Of course, not all these advantages could be at once perceived by a cavalier riding by in the dust of a column on the march, but enough was seen to inspire to heroic effort, and nerve to heroic death, the peerless soldier who dashed up the Emmitsburg road in hot haste on the morning of the 1st of July. General John F. Reynolds, the noblest sacrifice offered up on that ensanguined field, was in command of the 1st, 3rd, and 11th Corps, the left grand division of Meade's army. He had been ordered to Gettysburg to observe the enemy and to mask the retrograde movement to Pipe Creek. His advance, the 1st Corps, was 4 miles south of there, the others at Emmitsburg and Taneytown twice and 3 times as far. They all had their orders for the movement to the right and rear, but hearing from Buford early in the morning that the enemy was in his front in considerable force, Reynolds ordered the 1st Corps forward with all possible speed, sent for the other 2 to join him, and rode ahead with his own pickets, impelled not only by his soldierly spirit, but also by the feelings of a patriotic Pennsylvanian, repelling an invasion of his native state. Arriving at the seminary, west of the town, he met General Buford, and was immediately informed of the situation of affairs. Buford had taken possession of Gettysburg the day before, throwing his pickets well out along the Chambersburg road. There they had encountered the advance of Pettigrew's brigade of Heth's division and Hill's corps. Pettigrew, not suspecting the presence of an enemy, was coming into Gettysburg with the prosaic purpose of plundering the shoe stores, the footgear of his men having gone to pieces in the sharp marching of the last fortnight. Meeting Buford, he retired, without making any resistance, to Cashtown. Buford, knowing that this respite was only momentary, prepared to withstand the advance which was sure to come, and did come the next morning. Alone, with his 2 brigades of cavalry, he valiantly held the line of Willoughby's Run until Reynolds came to the rescue with Wadsworth's division, the rest of the 1st Corps under General Doubleday, who galloped on in front of his own advance, coming up soon afterwards. Reynolds found Buford anxiously surveying the field from the belfry of the Lutheran seminary, and only a moment's conference between these 2 thorough soldiers was needed to determine the morning's work. The enemy was there. The place for the great battle was just behind them. Their duty was to hold back the oncoming wave of Lee's forces until Meade could concentrate the Army of the Potomac to meet it. In a case so clear, the letter of his orders mattered little to a man like Reynolds. His duty was under his eyes, clearer and more sacred than anything written upon paper could be. He was the lifelong friend and comrade of Meade. They had commanded brigades together in McCall's division, and had risen step by step to be first and second in command of the Army of the Potomac. He felt sure Meade would approve his action, and resolved to make his fight there. He was as ready to sacrifice his life as his orders. The enemy were approaching in great force on the western side of Willoughby's Run, consisting of Heth's division of 4 brigades, and Reynolds at once made his preparations to meet them. There was a bit of woods just east of Willoughby's Run, midway between the two roads, and both sides rushed to seize it. Reynolds had just sent an order to Doubleday: "Hold on to the Hagerstown road, and I will take care of this one," the Chambersburg road, on which he had posted Cutler's brigade. He was watching Solomon Meredith's Iron Brigade enter the woods on one side and James J. Archer's Confederates going in on the other, when he was shot dead by a bullet through the brain. Doubleday, who had been placed temporarily in command of the First Corps, now took charge of the field, and the fighting began in earnest. At first it was favorable to the Union arms. Wadsworth on the right captured Archer and a considerable portion of his brigade. On the left, the attacking force was caught in a railroad cut beside the Chambersburg road, and a large number were killed and taken. Wadsworth's division held the field until about 11 o'clock, when the rest of the First Corps came up with a good supply of artillery. The Confederates, largely reinforced, were still pressing them severely when General Howard arrived with the 11th Corps and, by virtue of his rank, assumed direction of the engagement. Major General Schurz commanding the 11th Corps, and Doubleday remaining in command of the 1st. Howard immediately deployed his entire force to the west and north of the town, his left assisting Doubleday to hold the two roads on the west, and his right preparing to meet the attack of Ewell, who was now in sight on the Carlisle road. But his line was too extended. He attempted to cover too much. While the 11th Corps was hotly engaged along its entire front, Early came up on the right and attacked with a vigor there was no resisting. The gallant General Francis C. Barlow fell severely wounded. His division, which held the right, gave way. The damage could not be repaired, as the enemy had the superiority both of position and of numbers. Howard's troops were driven into Gettysburg, and the First Corps, thus left unsupported, were compelled to retire also, which they did slowly and with unbroken spirit. The enemy took advantage of the confusion of the retreat through the town, and, pressing closely upon the disordered Union right, they did great damage and made large captures. Before this, however, General Howard had occupied the hill on which the cemetery stood with Steinwehr's division, and, as the retreating troops poured eastward from the town on the Baltimore and Taneytown roads, they were at once taken in charge and posted in advantageous positions. The First Corps was placed on the left and the 11th on the right. Between 3:30 and 4 o'clock, while order was rapidly being established among these broken corps, General Hancock arrived on the field and, by Meade's orders, assumed command. His presence immediately exerted a remarkable calming and encouraging effect. All accounts agree as to the extraordinary influence wielded by Hancock upon the battlefield, an influence not wholly attributable to prestige or to great intellectual power. The vague term personal magnetism is the one most frequently chosen by observers to express it. He was then in the flower of his youth, a man of singularly handsome presence, tall and stalwart, with the eye and profile of an eagle, a strong voice, and a manner expressive throughout of soldierly resolution and ardor. His arrival alone, at that critical moment, was like the reinforcement of an army corps. It was a happy thought of General Meade to send Hancock forward in advance of his corps. As late as noon on the 1st, Meade had no thought of a great battle beginning that day. He wrote to Halleck at 12 o'clock, "The news proves my advance has answered its purpose. I shall not advance any, but prepare to receive an attack, in case Lee makes one. A battlefield is being selected to the rear, on which the army can be rapidly concentrated, on Pipe Creek, between Middleburg and Manchester, covering my depot at Westminster. If I am not attacked, and if I can from reliable intelligence have reason to believe I can attack with reasonable degree of success, I will do so. But at present, having relieved the pressure on the Susquehanna, I am now looking to the protection of Washington and fighting my army to the best advantage." But an hour later he added to this dispatch, "The enemy are advancing in force on Gettysburg, and I expect the battle will begin today." The battle had, as we have seen, already begun. Reynolds had made the precious sacrifice of his own life, and General Howard had sent back to headquarters an impressive account of the evil course of affairs and an urgent request for immediate assistance. General Meade's action upon this intelligence was prompt and decided. He did not for an instant hesitate as to the course he should pursue. He had been but 3 days in command of his army, yet in the midst of these trying circumstances he rose readily to the full height of his responsibility. His own orders issued that morning for the withdrawal to the chosen line of battle in the rear became at once as obsolete in his own mind as if they had been issued by Julius Caesar. He instantly sent Hancock to the front, and at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, before receiving the reports from his lieutenants at Gettysburg, he telegraphed to Washington that his whole army was in motion towards that place, that although he was not certain of the exact position of all the enemy's force, he hoped to defeat Hill and Ewell if Longstreet should not have joined them the next day, and that at all events he saw no other course than to hazard a general battle. Hancock occupied the northern crotchet of the Cemetery Range with what troops were available. Wadsworth's division was placed on the extreme right at Culp's Hill, the 11th Corps guarding the heights in front of Gettysburg, and the 2nd Corps extending as far as it would reach to the left, where it was supported by Sickles' dusty and travel-stained veterans who had come in haste from Emmitsburg. He then gave up the command to Slocum, who had just arrived, and who ranked everyone present, and mounting his horse galloped back to Meade at Taneytown, prepared to urge in the strongest possible language the advantages of Gettysburg as the field for battle. But he found that no such persuasion was necessary, and that Meade had already resolved to accept the field which the ordainment of events presented to him. The whole army, inspired by the same martial impulse, was marching to the scene of conflict with or without orders. Sickles was at Emmitsburg when he received the dispatch from Howard informing him of the desperate contest in which the advance was engaged. His position was such as to give him the keenest anxiety. He had been on his march to Gettysburg when he received the order withdrawing the army to Pipe Creek, and while preparing to obey that summons there came this new and pressing appeal from Howard. Meade was 10 miles away. Sickles resolved to waste not another minute in asking more definite instructions, but forced his column of wearied, and many of them barefooted, soldiers at their utmost speed to Gettysburg. He arrived there while Hancock was making his hurried preparations for the defense of the hill, and by his orders the 3rd Corps was posted on the left of the ridge. All night, by every road, the troops came streaming in. Part of the 3rd Corps and all of the 12th had arrived before nightfall, and from sunset till morning the rest were marching to their places under the light of the full moon. Meade himself came upon the field at 1 o'clock in the morning, a pale, tired-looking, hollow-eyed man, worn with toil and lack of sleep, with little of the appearance of a conventional hero about him, but stout in heart and clear in mind. General Lee had arrived upon the battlefield on the afternoon of the 1st in time to witness the final success of his troops. He ascended a commanding point upon Seminary Ridge and carefully studied the position assumed by the Army of the Potomac. Its strength was at once apparent to him, and he was evidently impressed by the steady attitude of the Union troops, and concluded not to order a general attack that evening. He sent a suggestion to General Ewell to carry Cemetery Hill if he thought such a movement was practicable, but he was warned against bringing on a general engagement until the arrival of the rest of his force. Ewell took advantage of the discretion allowed him and awaited the arrival of General Edward Johnson, so that all the latter part of the afternoon was left to Howard and Hancock, and after them to Slocum, to make their preparations for the coming conflict undisturbed. This was undoubtedly one of the most serious errors committed by General Lee in his campaign. His force was at that moment superior to that of the Federals. They were, besides, flushed with a great success which had been easily won, and his chances of carrying Cemetery Hill were greater at 4 o'clock on Wednesday than at any time afterwards. But, so far as can be judged from his excessively brief and dry report of this campaign, it is altogether probable that up to that moment Lee had not made up his mind to attack the Army of the Potomac at all. He himself says, "It had not been intended to fight a general battle at such a distance from our base unless attacked by the enemy," and the only reason he gives for following up the good fortune of the 1st of July was the difficulty of withdrawing his large trains through the mountains. The reason was not a valid one, as was shown by the ease with which he withdrew his trains after his defeat. The simple truth was, he imagined he saw a great victory in his grasp, and the mighty temptation was too much for his usual calm judgment. He was not forced by any purely military reason to attack the army posted on Cemetery Hill. It was entirely in his power, following the advice of Longstreet, the ablest general in his army, to move by the right flank upon the Emmitsburg road, and marching upon Frederick to maneuver Meade out of his position. This move would certainly have succeeded, for General Meade, so late as 3 o'clock on the 2d, telegraphed to Halleck, "If I find it hazardous to attack, or am satisfied the enemy is endeavoring to move to my rear and interpose between me and Washington, I shall fall back to my supplies at Westminster." It is perhaps too much to expect of any general in the position in which Lee found himself, after a partial victory on the 1st, to follow such prudent counsel. The appetite whetted by the taste of blood demanded more immediate gratification. A victory at Gettysburg offered so splendid a vista of both use and glory that he was willing to stake everything upon it. In view of the valuable results, he says, that would ensue from the defeat of the army of General Meade, it was thought advisable to renew the attack. It was General Meade's intention to forestall the attack of his adversary by assaulting the Confederate lines at an early hour in the morning. He ordered Slocum to prepare with his own corps, and the 5th to make a vigorous attack upon Ewell near the extreme left of his line. But General Slocum and General Warren, Chief of Engineers, having reconnoitered the position and having reported against an attack, General Meade abandoned that intention and concluded to wait for the arrival of the 6th Corps, and then to move the 5th to the left, and if the enemy still delayed action, to attack the Confederate right. On the morning of the 2d, Meade disposed his host in the following order. The 12th Corps under Slocum held the extreme right on Culp's Hill, and Howard, with the 11th, still held the cemetery, Wadsworth's division being placed between them. The crest of the cemetery ridge was occupied by the 2nd Corps under Hancock, with Sickles commanding the 3rd Corps on his left. The 5th Corps formed the reserve on the right. The 6th, which under Sedgwick was marching in all haste to the field, did not arrive till afternoon. About a mile distant from the Union lines, Lee's army swept in a wide curve from Benner's Hill on the east of Gettysburg to the high ground in front of the Round Tops. Ewell held the Confederate left, Hill the center, and Longstreet's troops, which were last to arrive, were posted on the extreme right. It was intended by General Meade that Sickles should prolong the line of Hancock to the left. Orders to this effect were given in general terms and without any inspection of the ground, so that when Sickles came on the morning of the 2d to establish his line of battle, he found himself in low and, to his eye, untenable ground, which was commanded by the Emmitsburg road, running along the ridge some 3/4 of a mile in his front, the ground between being much broken and furnishing cover at every point for an enemy's advance. He represented these facts to Meade and asked for more definite orders, which Meade at the time was too busy to give him, but sent General Henry J. Hunt, his chief of artillery, to look at the ground. General Hunt agreed with General Sickles that he would better his position by advancing his line towards the Emmitsburg road, which he at once proceeded to do. He advanced his 2 divisions to the higher ground in front of him, placing General Humphreys to the right and Birney to the left, the lines of the 2 divisions forming an angle at a point near the Emmitsburg road called the Peach Orchard, Humphreys' right being a considerable distance in front of Hancock's left, and Birney's left resting at the base of Little Round Top. It was a dangerous position, and entirely untenable if the 3rd Corps were to be left to itself, but with the assistance of reinforcements from the 5th Corps on the left and from Hancock on the right, General Sickles thought it could be held. After the troops were in position, General Meade came upon the ground, rather tardily, and as soon as he saw the state of affairs, he disapproved the action of General Sickles. But it was then too late to change the disposition which had been made, for even while the 2 generals were discussing the matter, the enemy's artillery opened from the woods near the Peach Orchard, and a furious assault began from Hood's division upon the refused line of Sickles' corps, running from the Peach Orchard to Round Top. It had been General Lee's intention that Longstreet, with what force he could get together, should attack at an early hour of the morning, but Longstreet, inspired by wiser counsels than those of his chief, saw more clearly than Lee all the difficulties of the enterprise, and spent a part of the morning in trying to persuade him to adopt the better plan of maneuvering by the right flank. Failing to convince him, he still pleaded for time, that the rest of his corps might join him before the attack. The 2nd Division, under McLaws, arrived in the middle of the day. He would gladly have waited until the 3rd, under Pickett, should have joined him also, But Lee, after a careful personal reconnaissance of the position occupied by the National left, at last gave Longstreet a positive order to attack upon that flank. It was after 4 o'clock when Hood's division was thrown with the greatest violence upon the refused line of General Sickles. A desperate and sanguinary conflict raged along that line. For nearly 2 hours Birney's division bore the brunt of the fight. They received and inflicted great damage, both armies fighting with equal and desperate courage. General Sickles was borne from the field, his leg having been shot away, shortly after 6 o'clock, and Birney succeeded, temporarily, to the command of the corps. Meantime McLaws had attacked Humphreys on the Emmitsburg road, to the north of the Peach Orchard, and, when the salient angle was broken, Humphreys was finally forced to retire to Cemetery Ridge. He accomplished this movement coolly and successfully. He communicated his own indomitable spirit to his men, and conducted the retreat, under a withering fire, so slowly and steadily that he was able to halt what was left of his division in the exact place assigned to them. Reinforcements from the Second Corps on the right and from the Fifth, which had come in on the left, protected the withdrawal of the troops from the advanced position and repulsed the pursuing enemy with great slaughter. There was a moment in the afternoon when the safety of the Union line was seriously compromised. The important position of Little Round Top was almost entirely undefended, and a portion of Hood's division, stealing up through the ravine of Plum Run, had almost succeeded in capturing it, when their advance was noticed by General Warren, Chief of Engineers, who happened, luckily, to be on that part of the field at the moment. There was no one on the hill but a few signal officers who, seeing the enemy approaching, were folding their flags to leave the station. Warren commanded them to make a show of still waving their flags, and hurried away to find some available force. The first troops he met were Barnes' division of the Fifth Corps, marching to reinforce Sickles. Warren, with a vehemence which could not be denied, seized upon a brigade of this division, commanded by Colonel Strong Vincent, which he hurried to the summit of the hill, while Charles E. Hazlett's battery, which was fortunately in the neighborhood, was pulled and dragged with all haste up the beetling crag. They were not an instant too soon. The two columns met on the hilltop, and a savage hand-to-hand fight ensued, which was continued and kept up by reinforcements on either side. The Confederates were at last driven from the crest down the precipitous slope, and the position, and with it the safety of the Union left, was secured. This was done at a terrible sacrifice. General Stephen H. Weed was killed. Hazlett, stooping to receive his last words, fell dead across his breast. Vincent, who was the first to reach the summit, was one of the first to fall. Young Colonel Patrick H. O'Rourke, just beginning a career to which his talents and his scholarship gave the most brilliant promise, was shot dead at the head of his regiment, the 140th New York. All along the Union left, the slaughter of general and field officers was very great. Besides Sickles, Charles K. Graham was wounded and captured. Samuel K. Zook and Edward E. Cross were killed. Several regiments lost all their field officers and were brought to the rear by captains. But the final successes of the field were with the Union arms. The last charge on the left was made by General Samuel W. Crawford, who securely held the ground on the right of Little Round Top. Both hills, which crowned the southern extremity of the ridge, were strongly garrisoned. Humphreys' braves had the satisfaction of advancing in the twilight and retaking the guns they had lost in their retreat, and before nightfall the whole line from Round Top to Cemetery Hill was firmly established. It was General Lee's desire that Ewell should assault the north side of Cemetery Hill, while the contest on the Confederate right was going on, and that Hill should observe the Union center and take advantage of any opportunity to attack. Ewell, attempting to carry out this plan, assaulted the 11th Corps with considerable energy and with such success that General Howard was compelled to call upon Hancock for assistance. He sent a brigade under Colonel Samuel S. Carroll, which rapidly drove the assaulting force from the hill. But later in the day, when the extreme right of the Federal line had been almost disgarnished by the withdrawal of troops to reinforce the left, General Johnson, commanding the old Stonewall Division, made an energetic attack from the direction of Rock Creek, and succeeded in occupying the intrenchments which had been left by Geary's division. He held this important point all night. After the day's fighting was over, General Meade called a council of war, and consulted his generals in regard to the question of fighting the battle out where they stood, or of taking up a new position. There was only one voice in the council. Every general there was in favor of deciding the contest on that spot, and Meade promptly adopted their judgment as his own. On the other side the same inevitable decision was reached. Although General Lee has been much criticized for continuing the battle on the third day, it is not easy to see how he could have done otherwise. It is true, he had not accomplished all he hoped for in the operations of the 2nd of July, but his partial successes were such as to render it impossible for him to withdraw. At the cost of terrible bloodshed he had gained the Emmitsburg road on the right, and had established himself in the Federal intrenchments on his left. His center had hardly been engaged, and Pickett's strong division was to reinforce him during the day. His army was in fine spirits. He could not, even if he had been inclined, resist the martial impulse which was sweeping them on to what they expected would prove the great and crowning victory of the war. The only thing which was there to trouble hope and joy was the grave countenance and the disapproving words of his ablest general. But he put aside the remonstrances of Longstreet with his lofty good humor, and ordered him to make ready to assault the Federal left center. The morning of the 3d of July brought a heavy responsibility to General Meade, which he accepted, if not with the high hope and buoyancy of his opponent, with equal coolness and resolution. It was not in his power to await the enemy's attack. The force which had lodged itself upon his right flank could not be permitted to remain there. It was dangerously near the Baltimore road, and must be dislodged at any risk or cost. He ordered it assaulted, therefore, at the earliest dawn. He was not at all certain of the issue of the day, but he prepared for either fate with prudence and courage. In the midst of the roar of the guns which were opening upon Johnson's intruders in the intrenchments on Culp's Hill, he telegraphed to General William H. French at Frederick that, in case the enemy should be beaten that day and fall back towards the Potomac, he wished him to reoccupy Harper's Ferry and to do all he could to annoy and harass the retreat. If the result of today's operations, he said, should be our discomfiture and withdrawal, you are to look to Washington and throw your force there for its protection. The ground of Culp's Hill was exceedingly broken and difficult, and an obstinate and desultory fight raged there for several hours. But Johnson was at last driven from his position, and Geary's men marched once more into their intrenchments, which had been in possession of the enemy overnight. The little battle of Culp's Hill, although it lasted a good while, occupied but a small portion of either army, and after it was finished a singular silence fell upon the field. The day was clear and hot. The lassitude of midsummer seemed for several hours to have succeeded the furious activity of the last 2 days. There was something disquieting to General Meade in the intense stillness which at noon prevailed in the enemy's camp. There were constant indications, however, of a movement to the Confederate right, masked as far as possible by the woods and by the crest of Seminary Ridge. General Lee had been employing the entire forenoon in preparations for his attack, and, after a thorough consultation and careful survey of the entire field, he again resolved to try to carry the crest of Cemetery Hill, and entrusted the work once more to the able though unwilling hands of Longstreet. There was a striking analogy between Burnside's assault of Fredericksburg and the one which Lee was to deliver on the 3d of July. In both cases a strong position, powerfully defended, was to be attacked by brave and disciplined troops, under corps commanders who did not believe the attack could succeed. The troops chosen for this final onslaught upon the Union line were on the right the division of General Pickett, composed of the Virginia cavalry, the flower of the Confederate army, supported by Wilcox's division, and on the left, Pettigrew's and Trimble's divisions that, like Wilcox's, belonged to the command of A.P. Hill. While the Union troops were waiting with intense expectation, the midday silence was broken by the report of 2 guns fired at a short interval, and then, all at once, from every point on the heights opposite, the simultaneous discharge of 130 pieces of artillery filled the air with smoke and flame, and the wide circuit of the surrounding hills with continuous volleying thunders. Never in the experience of any of those seasoned soldiers on either height was heard anything comparable. Hancock and Gibbon, Webb and Warren, to whom the thunder of the captains and the shouting had become everyday experiences, all agree in saying that they never heard or imagined anything so terrific. But the Union artillery was not slow in responding. There was not enough room in the Union lines to bring so great a number of guns into action as those with which the Confederates had crowned the wide sweep of the opposing hills, but General Hunt had managed to get some 70 guns into position, and they replied with great spirit to furious cannonade from Seminary Ridge and the Emmitsburg road. This titanic artillery duel, in which 200 guns were engaged, lasted about an hour. At the end of that time General Hunt ordered his batteries gradually to cease firing, He desired to give his guns time to cool, and to reserve his ammunition for the infantry attack which it was now evident was coming. General Lee, who expected important results from this extraordinary cannonade, thought he had silenced the Federal artillery, and the explosion of several caissons confirmed him in this belief. It is remarkable that so little damage was done by this prodigious fire. The shifty veterans of the Army of the Potomac had taken advantage of every hillock and every boulder to protect themselves. The artillery suffered somewhat, but whenever a battery was disabled its place was immediately supplied from the reserve. A certain number of faint hearts melted away from the line into the Baltimore road, but at the end of an hour of such fire as the world has rarely seen, the Union lines were as strong as at the beginning. It may be said that they were even stronger, for, while they were not in the least shaken, they had drunk of the delight of battle, and waited with firm nerves and eager eyes for the coming assault. The fury of his own bombardment had not inspired Longstreet with any new confidence. He still believed the plan of his general-in-chief to be rash and well-nigh hopeless. He gave an order to Colonel E.P. Alexander, his chief of artillery, to watch the effect of the cannonading and give, on his own judgment, the signal of attack when the Federal line should appear to be broken. Alexander did not relish the responsibility. Before and during the artillery duel he sent messages to Longstreet, which opened the door for a change in the orders. At last, as his ammunition got short, and the Union fire slackened, he let Pickett know that if the charge was to be made, then was the time to advance. Pickett sought Longstreet personally and demanded his orders. Longstreet, drawn one way by the commands of his chief and the other by his own convictions, seemed unable, in his anguish of mind, to utter the fatal words required of him. Pickett at last said, "Very well, I shall go forward," to which Longstreet answered only with an affirmative nod. The Union soldiers on Cemetery Ridge now had the opportunity to enjoy a wonderful spectacle. No sight so beautiful in a soldier's eyes, so full of the pomp and circumstance of glorious war, had ever before been seen upon this continent, as when Pickett led forth his troops from behind the ridge where they had lain concealed, and formed them into a column for attack. There was nothing like it possible in the swamps of Chickahominy, or the tangled thickets of Rappahannock, or on the wooded shores of Rapidan. There no enemy was visible half a musket shot away, but here, at a distance of nearly a mile across a cultivated valley, part of which was covered with waving grain, and part smooth in stubble fields, the whole irradiated with the unclouded beams of the July sun, an army formed itself in line of battle under the eyes of an appreciative adversary. It came on across the valley in the form of a wedge, of which Pickett's own division, about 5,000 strong, formed the finely tempered point. On the left was Heth's division, commanded by Pettigrew, swelled by a part of Trimble's division. On the right the column of Wilcox moved forward in support, altogether some 17,000 men. They came forward with the steadiness of troops on parade. The direction they took at first, if retained, would have brought them upon the First Corps, but, before they had advanced halfway across the valley, they began to bear off to the left and directly upon Hancock's front. The Federal artillery, which they had supposed to be silenced, now opened upon them from right and left with terrible effect. George J. Stannard's Vermont brigade, occupying a little grove in advance of the Union line, poured a destructive fire into Pickett's right flank, causing it to double in somewhat upon the center. Alexander Hays, on Hancock's right, met the advancing column of Pettigrew with such fury and vigor of attack that a large part of it was captured, a still greater number gave way and fled to the rear, and those that were left alive moved to their right and joined the assaulting force of Pickett. Diminishing at every step, this devoted column moved on, and at last struck a point where Webb's slender brigade held the Union line. A short and terrible contest here took place. Two small regiments of Webb's held a stone fence a few rods in advance of the main line. As the Confederates leaped over this slight barrier, these regiments moved to the rear. The enemy, encouraged by this seeming success, came on with yells of triumph, imagining the Union line was broken. But the apparent fugitives stopped among their guns, and, encouraged by the example of their young general, fought with desperate energy, while from right and left, in a confused mass of unorganized valor, regiments and brigades rushed from their own places to join Webb and Hays in their heroic defense of the crest. If properly drawn up in line of battle, the mass of troops that gathered to the rescue at this point would have been 4 lines deep. But control was for an instant lost. The men could not be restrained. The colonels could not make their voices heard in the roar and tumult of battle. Men fought as individuals. Such chaos could only last for a few moments. The extreme point reached by the assaulting column was a little clump of woods where Lieutenant Alonzo H. Cushing, a young artillery officer, brother of Commander Cushing, who destroyed the Albemarle, stood by his gun. Though desperately hurt, with his last strength he fired a final shot, and in the instant of death saluted his general with a gay farewell. General Lewis A. Armistead, who was foremost in the assault, rushed forward waving his hat upon his sword point, and fell mortally wounded near Cushing's battery. This was the last leap of the advancing tide. From this moment it ebbed away. Pickett, with the few officers left him, gave the superfluous order to retire, for the fight was over, and already the plain was covered with fugitives, flowing back, not so much over the track of their advance as towards the Confederate center. The Union soldiers, springing forward, captured a great many prisoners, and gathered in a wide harvest of battle flags. Meanwhile, Wilcox had advanced his supporting column obliquely upon Pickett's right until he found himself making an isolated attack between Little Round Top and the main battlefield. Stannard, who had wrought such havoc upon Pickett's right flank, now wheeled and tried the same tactics, with equal effect, upon Wilcox's left. The batteries on the spur of Little Round Top also rained death upon him, and the troops in his front received him with a sharp musketry fire. There was nothing to do but to turn and save himself with what speed he could. The briefest and proportionately the bloodiest of the 3 days of battle at Gettysburg was at an end. 2 cavalry fights had taken place during the day. Kilpatrick at 8 o'clock received orders to move to the right and rear of Longstreet and attack with his division and the regular brigade. His advance served to occupy the attention of Longstreet's forces in front of the Round Tops during the assault on Cemetery Ridge. At 5:30, Kilpatrick, with more bravery than judgment, ordered a charge which resulted in the death of the gallant and promising young general, Ellen J. Farnsworth, and the loss of many of his men. Jeb Stuart, on Lee's extreme left, took up a position which menaced Meade's line of retreat on the Baltimore road, and was there attacked by the force of D. McM. Gregg and George A. Custer. A general cavalry battle ensued, in which charges and countercharges were made, but with little advantage to either side. Stuart at last gave way, and the Federal cavalry held the field. It is clear that General Meade did not immediately comprehend the magnitude of his victory. In the dispatch which he wrote in the evening to General Halleck, he greatly understated the extent of his success, speaking of the victory merely as a handsome repulse of the enemy. So desperate had been the contest, so intense the strain of anxiety for 3 days, that there was not left enough of energetic impulse to press his great advantage. General Crawford, it is true, was sent forward on the left to reconnoiter the battlefield of the 2nd of July. He came upon a brigade of Hood's division, capturing several hundred prisoners and many thousand stands of arms. The enemy fled across a little brook, an affluent of Plum Run, and was not further pursued. Hancock, while he was borne severely wounded from the field, dictated from his stretcher a note to Meade, begging him to pursue the broken enemy, but, in the deep fatigue and lassitude of a great deliverance, the General-in-Chief preferred not to risk the important results already gained by any perilous enterprise. He had as yet no adequate idea of the injury he had inflicted upon the enemy, and his own losses had been enormous. Of the men upon whom he most leaned, his trusted comrades through 2 years of battle, Reynolds was dead, Sickles disabled, Hancock, Gibbon, Doubleday, Warren, Webb, and many others were wounded, and incapable of holding up his hands in the battles which a keen pursuit would have brought upon him. General Lee had one moment of supreme exultation and triumph in this memorable afternoon. It was when he saw the blue flag of Virginia, borne by Pickett's troops, waving on the crest of Cemetery Ridge among the Union guns. His gratification lasted only an instant, for a moment later, he saw the Virginia battle flags dropping thickly to the ground and his most trusted troops flowing back towards him like a broken wave. He hastened at his utmost speed to meet this returning column, and did all in his power to calm and encourage his beaten soldiers. Again, like Burnside at Fredericksburg, he took all the blame and all the responsibility upon himself. He rode towards the peach orchard, where Colonel Alexander still commanded the artillery, and there, with Longstreet, concerted what hasty means of defense were in their power to meet the attack which they thought, of course, would follow. But as the hours passed by, and the long summer day faded into twilight and no attack was made, General Lee concluded to mass his entire army on Seminary Ridge and prepare for defense or retreat in the morning. The next day was the 4th of July, to be made memorable for the second time to all generations of Americans, mingling the associations of Gettysburg and Vicksburg with those of Philadelphia in the last century. The reconnaissances sent out by General Meade to his left and to his right found the enemy still in position in front of the Round Tops, but from Brenner's Hill and from the town of Gettysburg everything had disappeared. Most of the enemy's wounded and the unburied dead were lying in the deserted field of battle. In the course of the day a request for a truce and exchange of prisoners was received from General Lee, which General Meade, under the circumstances, very properly declined. The day passed away in the Union army in the care of the wounded and the last offices to the dead. Even yet General Meade was not aware of the magnitude of his victory. He issued, it is true, a brave and inspiriting order of the day, announcing that the enemy was utterly baffled and defeated, and saying, "Our task is not yet accomplished, and the commanding general looks to the army for greater efforts to drive from our soil every vestige of the presence of the invader." But at noon he telegraphed General Halleck, saying merely that the enemy had thrown back his left, that we had occupied Gettysburg, and that he should require some time to get up supplies and rest his army. A violent rainstorm came on during the day, which formed another reason for delay. At night he called together his corps commanders in council of war. He put to them the question whether to remain at Gettysburg or to take immediate measures to attack the enemy or cut off his retreat. The majority were in favor of remaining where they were, keeping a close watch upon the movements of the enemy. On the morning of the 5th, the Confederates were discovered to be in full retreat. General Lee, as we have seen, gave as a reason for attacking the Federal army in position the difficulty of moving his trains through the mountains, but after his defeat he found no difficulty in moving those trains encumbered still further by thousands of wounded and prisoners. Through the night and the storm he retired by the Fairfield and Cashtown roads. Meade acted with sufficient promptness on receiving this news. He resolved to put his army in march on the enemy's flank by way of Middleton and the South Mountain passes, while he sent General Sedgwick with a considerable force in direct pursuit. Sedgwick came upon Lee's rear guard at Fairfield Pass and found him in a position so strong that it was unadvisable to attack him. He reported this to Meade and joined the rest of the army in its march southward. The news of this victory was received at Washington with great rejoicing, and the government ordered every man whom it could reach to reinforce General Meade at Frederick. The President accompanied his generous words of praise and congratulation to the general with strict injunctions to give Lee no rest or respite. On the 7th he sent the inspiring news of the surrender of Vicksburg and told Meade that if he could complete his work so gloriously prosecuted thus far, by the literal or substantial destruction of Lee's army, the rebellion would be over. On the same day he informed him that he had been appointed a brigadier general in the regular army of the United States. Almost every hour Meade received from the War Department some words of stimulus or encouragement. Halleck wrote, "You have given the enemy a stunning blow at Gettysburg. Follow it up and give him another before he can reach the Potomac." All through the 7th and 8th of July those pressing dispatches continued. General Meade seemed to grow weary of them at last, and began on the afternoon of the 8th to insist upon the difficulties of the enterprise so pressingly commended to him. "I expect," he says, "to find the enemy in a strong position well covered with artillery, and I do not desire to imitate his example at Gettysburg and assault a position where the chances were so greatly against success. I wish in advance to moderate the expectations of those who in ignorance of the difficulties to be encountered may expect too much." In this strain the correspondence continued for the next 3 days, the government urging General Meade forward with as much pressure as was consistent with proper courtesy and consideration for a meritorious officer who had just rendered an inestimable service, and the general expressing his intention to do all he could and his sense of the difficulties in the way. In the meantime, General Lee had arrived at the Potomac and taken up his positions on the line from Williamsport to Falling Waters. He found his pontoon bridge partly destroyed by General French, and the river so swollen by the rains as to be unfordable. In this critical condition he did all that was in his power. He set to work to reconstruct his bridge, and while waiting for the river to fall, he strongly intrenched himself against attack. General Meade arrived in his front on the 10th, and for 2 days, with the utmost caution, advanced inch by inch until the two armies were less than a mile apart. On the 12th he announced his intention to attack the enemy the next day, unless something intervenes to prevent it, for the reason that delay will strengthen the enemy and will not increase my force. Unfortunately something did intervene. It was a council of war. On the night of the 12th he called his corps commanders together, and a large majority unqualifiedly opposed the projected attack. Meade himself favored it, but he was supported only by General Wadsworth, who, as a civilian general, did not impose his opinion with much authority upon the council, and by General Howard, whose bad luck at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg had deprived him of much of his influence. In the face of this opposition, Meade felt himself too new in command of the army to disregard it entirely. He therefore resolved to pass the next day in a thorough series of reconnaissances, and if he could find a weak place in the enemy's line, to assault it. He announced this decision in a dispatch to the War Department, and received in reply a vehement message signed by Halleck, but evidently inspired by the President himself. You are strong enough to attack and defeat the enemy before he can effect a crossing. Act upon your own judgment and make your generals execute your orders. Call no council of war. It is proverbial that councils of war never fight. Do not let the enemy escape. The next morning, July 14th, Meade's earliest reconnaissances proved how just had been the fears of the government. Lee's lines were found deserted. He had crossed, in the night, a part of his force by the bridge which he had repaired at Falling Waters, and a part at Williamsport, where the river had fallen enough during the last 24 hours to be fordable. The President, on receipt of this news, sent General Meade a dispatch expressing his great dissatisfaction at the result, which General Meade felt so keenly that he immediately requested to be relieved from command of the army. The President replied through Halleck that the dispatch was not intended as a censure, but as a stimulus to action, and declined to accept his resignation. The cavalry started at once in pursuit and succeeded in capturing a brigade of infantry and some guns and flags at Falling Waters. The 12th and 13th had been passed by the President in intense anxiety, and when, on the 14th, he heard of Lee's escape, he suffered one of the deepest and bitterest disappointments of the war. "We had them within our grasp," he said. "We had only to stretch forth our hands and they were ours, and nothing I could say or do could make the army move." He had been most unfavorably impressed by a phrase in Meade's general order after the victory, in which he spoke of driving the invader from our soil. He said upon reading it, "This is a dreadful reminiscence of McClellan. It is the same spirit that moved him to claim a great victory because Pennsylvania and Maryland were safe. Will our generals never get that idea out of their heads? The whole country is our soil." He regretted that he had not himself gone to the army and personally issued the order for an attack. The President's disappointment lasted through the week. He said at one time, "Our army held the war in the hollow of their hand, and they would not close it." And again, "We had gone through all the labor of tilling and planting an enormous crop, and when it was ripe we did not harvest it. Still," he added, with his habitual instinctive justice, "I am very grateful to Meade for the great service he did at Gettysburg." And at the end of the week, having received a letter from General Howard justifying Meade's entire action at Williamsport, the President answered him expressing his deep mortification at the escape of Lee, rendered deeper by the high hopes inspired by the brilliant conduct of our troops at Gettysburg. He referred to his own long cherished and often expressed conviction that if the enemy ever crossed the Potomac he might be destroyed. He said that Meade and his army had expended their skill and toil and blood up to the ripe harvest, and then allowed it to go to waste. But he added that, after the lapse of several days, he now felt profoundly grateful to Meade and his army for what they had done, without indulging in any criticisms for what they had not done, and General Meade had his full confidence as a brave and skillful officer, and a true man. While the President's disappointment and irritation were at their keenest, he wrote a letter to General Meade, which he never signed or sent. It was not an unusual proceeding with him to put upon paper in this way his expressions of dissatisfaction, and then to lay them away, rather than wound a deserving public servant by even merited censure. The letter is given as the clearest statement which could be made of the failure to reap the full harvest of the Gettysburg victory. "I have just seen your dispatch to General Halleck, asking to be relieved of your command because of a supposed censure of mine. I am very, very grateful to you for the magnificent success you gave the cause of the country at Gettysburg, and I am sorry now to be the author of the slightest pain to you. But I was in such deep distress myself that I could not restrain some expression of it. I have been oppressed nearly ever since the Battle of Gettysburg by what appeared to be evidences that yourself and General Couch and General Smith were not seeking a collision with the enemy, but were trying to get him across the river without another battle. What these evidences were, if you please, I hope to tell you at some time when we shall both feel better. The case, summarily stated, is this. You fought and beat the enemy at Gettysburg, and, of course, to say the least, his loss was as great as yours. He retreated, and you did not, as it seemed to me, pressingly pursued him. But a flood in the river detained him till, by slow degrees, you were again upon him. You had at least 20,000 veteran troops directly with you, and as many more raw ones within supporting distance, all in addition to those who fought with you at Gettysburg, while it was not possible that he had received a single recruit. And yet you stood and let the flood run down, bridges be built, and the enemy move away at his leisure without attacking him. And Couch and Smith, the latter left Carlisle in time, upon all ordinary calculation, to have aided you in the last battle at Gettysburg, but he did not arrive. At the end of more than 10 days, I believe 12, under constant urging, he reached Hagerstown from Carlisle, which is not an inch over 55 miles, if so much, and Couch's movement was very little different. Again, my dear General, I do not believe you appreciate the magnitude of the misfortune involved in Lee's escape. He was within your easy grasp, and to have closed upon him would, in connection with our other late successes, have ended the war. As it is, the war will be prolonged indefinitely. If you could not safely attack Lee last Monday, how could you possibly do so south of the river, when you can take with you very few more than 2/3 of the force you then had in hand? It would be unreasonable to expect, and I do not expect, that you can now effect much. Your golden opportunity is gone, and I am distressed immeasurably because of it. I beg you will not consider this a prosecution or persecution of yourself. As you had learned that I was dissatisfied, I have thought it best to kindly tell you why. End of chapter 9.
Chapter 10 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 7, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 10, Vicksburg. The town of Vicksburg stands on a plateau some 200 feet above the river level, which has been cut and carved by the rains of centuries so as to present a chaos of ravines and ridges running in every direction. The hills are composed of a peculiarly tough and fine-grained clay, and the ravines, cut out of them by the running streams, retain their forms for many years, only gradually widening under the climate and weather. Except where the streams that form them are very large, the ravines are extremely narrow at the bottom. They are so steep that it is impossible for a full-armed soldier to climb them. The only way in which this network of hills and chasms can be traversed is by roads running along the crests of the ridges. All these crests were fully commanded by the Confederate works, and it was this which made the siege of Vicksburg so tedious and toilsome an enterprise. When Grant arrived before the entrenchments on the evening of May 18th, he thought it possible that the defeats of the last week had so demoralized and discouraged the defenders of the place that a quick rush of his victorious troops might carry the works by a coup de main. He therefore ordered a general attack on the afternoon of the 19th. Sherman's corps got up to the works, but as McClernand's and McPherson's were at a greater distance, they were unable to afford Sherman the necessary support, and the attack failed, with no advantage to the Union forces except a nearer approach to the enemy's works and the gaining of better ground for a future attempt. General Grant did not wait long for his second trial. The reasons which he gave in his report for the second assault have been generally accepted by military critics as sound, in spite of the failure of the enterprise. He believed the assault could be made successful. Secondly, he knew that Johnston was at Canton and was being rapidly reinforced. He was anxious, therefore, to take the place before Johnston could fall upon his rear, and, having done this, he would himself have been able to turn upon Johnston and drive him from the state before the season was too late for campaigning. And finally, he says, the troops themselves were impatient to possess Vicksburg, and would not have worked in the trenches with the same zeal, believing it unnecessary, that they did after their failure to carry the enemy's works. He therefore ordered, on the evening of the 21st, an assault all along the line at 10 o'clock the next morning, and caused all the corps commanders to set their watches by his, so that the assault might be made at the same instant. This was done according to orders, and with equal bravery and energy in all three of the corps, and with equal lack of success. Sherman's, McPherson's, and McClernand's soldiers all rushed with the same valor for the narrow roads through which alone the assault could be made. Each planted their flags upon the outer walls of the enemy's works. All were met with an energetic defense and repulsed with heavy loss. A bitter controversy arose after the battle between General McClernand on the one side and General Grant and his friends on the other, in regard to an unfortunate incident by which the Union losses were greatly increased. Grant watched the attack from a hill on the Jackson Road, which commanded a view of all the roads on which the assault was made. He saw the forward rush, the blaze of fire from the enemy's parapet, the planting of the Union colors on the outward slope, the check of his soldiers and their pause in the ditches. He was satisfied that the attack had failed, and, starting to communicate with Sherman in regard to the next step to be taken, he received a dispatch from General McClernand saying he was hard-pressed and asking for reinforcements. He continued his ride to Sherman's position, and, on reaching there, received a second dispatch from McClernand, saying that he had part possession of 2 forts and that the stars and stripes were floating over them. Neither Grant nor Sherman placed full credence in this enthusiastic dispatch, but both agreed that it was impossible to neglect so important a message at such a time. Sherman said the note was official and must be credited, and offered to renew the assault with new troops. At McPherson's headquarters, whither he instantly hastened, General Grant received a third dispatch from McClernand of the same import, and at last ordered the attack to be renewed. The devoted soldiers sprang once more to the assault with the finest courage and energy, but it was useless. They were everywhere repulsed again, and the renewed attempt only added heavily to the list of the day's casualties. General McClernand always insisted that his dispatches were correct, and that he would have taken the town if he had been properly supported. But the facts seemed to be that only Sergeant Joseph E. Griffith of the 22nd Iowa, with a squad of men, got into the enemy's works, and they were all killed but the valorous sergeant himself, who came out safely, bringing some prisoners with him. This was General McClernand's last feat of arms. Unwilling to trust his exploits of the 22nd of May to any less intelligent or friendly chronicler than himself, he wrote on the 30th of May and published to his troops, and not to his troops alone, but to his fellow citizens in the North, a congratulatory order in which he recounted, in the style of Napoleon in Italy, the labors and the triumphs of the 13th Army Corps, giving especial prominence to the affair of the 22nd. If he had confined himself to the doughty deeds of his own soldiers, it might have passed unnoticed, but he unfortunately sought to gild his own achievements by slighting those of his comrades, and to place his own desert in a brighter light he even insinuated that the general-in-chief had not properly supported him. When this order, published in a St. Louis newspaper, came back to the camp, it occasioned such effervescence as may easily be imagined in the corps of Sherman and McPherson. Both these generals joined immediately in a protest to General Grant against their censorious colleague, and Grant, fully sympathizing in their resentment, immediately relieved General McClernand from the command of the 13th Army Corps, assigning in his place, subject to the President's approval, that able and modest soldier, E.O.C. Ord. In announcing this action to General Halleck, Grant said that he had tolerated General McClernand long after he thought the good of the service demanded his removal, which, he added, now that it had taken place, had given general satisfaction, the 13th Army Corps sharing perhaps equally in the feeling with other corps of the Army. After this severe repulse, which cost the Union Army more than 3,000 men, with no compensating advantages whatever, Grant gave up all thought of taking the place by storm, and resolved upon a regular siege. In the peculiarities of topography to which we have already referred, this siege differs from any other in history. Vicksburg was, properly speaking, not a fortress, but an entrenched camp, stretching for miles along the heights of the Mississippi, and defended by innumerable gullies and ravines almost impassable to troops. Grant's forces at the beginning were altogether insufficient for the complete investment of such a camp. At the outset of the campaign, his forces numbered about 43,000, though at the close his army had been increased to 75,000 men. In his official report, Pemberton says that when he moved into the defenses, he had 28,000 effectives. The parole lists after the surrender accounted for 29,491 men, which included the non-effectives. Not being able to garnish the entire semicircle of investment with troops, Grant contented himself, at the beginning, with holding and strongly occupying the northern half of it, Sherman's corps holding the bank of the Mississippi and the heights to the east of it, McPherson coming next, and McClernand upon his left. General Jacob G. Lauman arrived 2 days after the assault and was placed in position on McClernand's left to guard the Hall's Ferry and the Warrenton roads, which enter Vicksburg from the south. Brigadier General John MacArthur, with 3 brigades, had already joined McPherson's corps and strengthened his line, and on the 11th of June the division of General Herron arrived from the other side of the river and completed the investment by taking up a strong position on the river south of the town. Lauman, moving up to the right, formed a close connection with Hovey, thus hermetically closing all the avenues of approach to Vicksburg. Now, for the first time in his career, Grant, wishing by an overwhelming force to ensure the capture of the town and to defend himself against the threatened attack of Johnston, asked for reinforcements, which, even before his request was received, were promptly and ungrudgingly sent him as fast as they were needed or could be used, so that he was able, on the 8th of June, to say in a dispatch to Washington, "Vicksburg is closely invested. I have a spare force of about 30,000 men with which to repel anything from the rear." The troops, having been satisfied by the slaughter of the 22nd of the impossibility of storming the works in their front and of the absolute necessity of hard work to capture them, labored for 6 weeks with cheerful and uncomplaining fortitude in the drudgery of the siege. The army was most imperfectly provided with all the material considered essential for the prosecution of a work of this sort, and the ingenuity of the American soldier found constant exercise in the invention of devices to supply these deficiencies. They wattled their gabions with crushed cane, which abounded in the ravines and hollows. They took empty barrels from the commissary department, which, bound about with fascines of cane, made excellent sap rollers. They had no cohorn mortars, and so improvised them by shrinking iron bands on cylinders of hard wood and boring them for shells. The Negro refugees from the surrounding counties came in and worked with cheerful and efficient industry under the novel stimulus of regular wages. The peculiar nature of the ground was the occasion of all sorts of eccentric siege inventions. When it became necessary to cross one of the gullies commanded by the enemy's fire, they would build in the night strong parapets of logs, manning them with picked riflemen, under which the working parties were perfectly protected the next day, for the first shot from the rebel works would be answered by a deadly reply from the log parapets. The engineer's report refers in one instance to a reconnaissance of a rebel ditch obtained by mounting a mirror upon a sap roller. As the siege went on from day to day, and the hostile armies came nearer and nearer together, they were constantly within sound of each other's voices, and friendly conversations continually took place between soldiers who would have destroyed each other in a moment with their rifles if they had come within sight. For siege operations of this enormous extent, the force of engineers in the army was, of course, altogether inadequate. Grant, Sherman, and McPherson multiplied themselves all along the line. Every graduate of West Point in the army was assigned to energetic duty, and the cleverest and most capable collegians from the volunteer regiments were detailed and given an opportunity to show what their Euclid and Legendre had done for them. While holding the enemy in front, in this grip of iron, Grant was equally vigilant in regard to the enemy in his rear. After his reinforcements arrived, he felt strong enough to remove Sherman from his duty on the heights above Vicksburg and to place him in command of a large army to observe Johnston. He gave him Generals Parke, Washburn, James M. Tuttle, MacArthur, and Osterhaus, who massed a force of about 30,000 men, and a strong division of McPherson's was also held in constant readiness to join him. Sherman occupied the country from Haynes Bluff on the left to a bridge over the Black River on the right, a space of 8 miles. Foraging expeditions sent out previously had made a waste of the entire region between the two rivers, gathering large supplies for the Union Army and spoiling the country to the point of starvation to prevent General Johnston from drawing provisions from it. 2 incidents of the siege, from which important results were expected on the one side and on the other, but which had in the end no effect upon the march of events, deserve perhaps a word of notice. Shortly after the assault of the 22nd of May, an attempt was made to enfilade the enemy's batteries upon Fort Hill, by which it was thought that an important position on the Confederate left might be carried. It was therefore attacked from the river with that readiness which Porter always showed when his assistance was needed by the army, on the morning of the 27th of May. But nothing came of it, except the destruction of the gunboat Cincinnati, which was sunk in half an hour by the plunging fire from the guns of Fort Hill. After this, no further attack was made by the Navy, which, however, continued to lend valuable assistance by the bombardment of the town. The other incident was a diversion, on the west side of the river at Milliken's Bend, by a division under General John G. Walker, sent from Arkansas by General Kirby Smith. Milliken's Bend had been left undefended except by a small garrison consisting chiefly of colored troops from Louisiana. The garrison was assailed with great energy by the Confederates, and the attack at first seemed to promise a complete success. But the garrison, after having been driven out of their works to the shelter of a levee by the riverside, there rallied, and with the assistance of the gunboats Choctaw and Lexington, which, as usual, were ready when needed, the assault was checked and finally repulsed. A brigade of the 15th Corps was sent across the river the next day, and this, together with the Marine Brigade under Alfred W. Ellett, drove Walker along the Shreveport Railroad to Monroe. This raid, which, it was hoped, might have opened the gates of the western frontier to Pemberton's army, came to nothing, and even if they had succeeded in taking and holding Milliken's Bend, such occupation would probably not have been of long continuance, and the attempt to evacuate Vicksburg under the fire of Porter's guns would have been nothing less than desperate. While Grant was pushing his saps and mines inch by inch up to the Confederate works, Johnston was doing his best to bring together an army at Canton sufficient to raise the siege of Vicksburg. He soon found himself at the head of a not inconsiderable force. During the first days of the siege, he was joined by the brigades of Generals Gist, M.D. Ector, and Evander McNair. Loring's division, ragged and travel-stained from its long wanderings, reached him 4 days after the Battle of Champion's Hill, and S.B. Maxey came in from the Port Hudson Army some days later. By the 4th of June, he received the additional reinforcements of a brigade under N.G. Evans, a division under General Breckinridge, and a cavalry division commanded by W.H. Jackson, amounting to 2,800 men, a force, according to the Confederate War Department, of 32,000, but which General Johnston, after the habit of Confederate generals, diminishes to 24,000. Although he says in his report that it was not 1/3 the force of the enemy, it really was, in those first days of June, not very much inferior to the victorious army of Grant, and if it could have been joined with the army of Pemberton before Grant's reinforcements arrived, Johnston would have found himself at the head of a force largely in excess of the Union army. Johnston complains bitterly, in his report and in his narrative, of his deficiency in every arm of the service, but it cannot be denied that during the whole month of June his army was as deficient in leadership as in anything else. Luck, as well as some other things, was against him. He sent a dispatch to General Franklin Gardiner directing the evacuation of Port Hudson, But before it reached him, the investment of that post was complete. In answer to Pemberton's repeated requests in the latter days of May for some demonstration which should relieve him, he answered on the 29th that he was too weak to save Vicksburg, that he could do nothing more than attempt to save the garrison, and invited suggestions from Pemberton as to the manner of accomplishing this. During the whole month of June, the correspondence between them continued on the same lines, Pemberton representing from day to day his increasing needs, and Johnston giving what scant encouragement he could. At last, Pemberton, on the 21st of June, suggested that Johnston should march upon Grant north of the Jackson Railroad, driving in his pickets at night, and at daylight next morning engage him heavily with skirmishers, occupying him during the entire day, that on that night he would attempt to escape by the Warrenton Road by Hankinson's Ferry, at which point Johnston would previously send a brigade of cavalry and 2 field batteries to cover the crossing. The messenger who brought this dispatch told Johnston that it was Pemberton's opinion that the attempt could not be made with less than 40,000 men. Johnston saw, in this verbal message, an excuse for postponing the desperate enterprise proposed to him, and answered on the following day that there was hope of cooperation with General Taylor from the west bank of the river, that he would himself try to make a diversion in Pemberton's favor in a day or 2, that he feared his force was too small, and he gave Pemberton the cold comfort of suggesting that he had better communicate with General Taylor and try to cross the river at the last moment. But by this time Pemberton's hopes had so faded that he wrote on the same day, the 22nd, suggesting that Johnston should propose terms of surrender to General Grant, saying that he might hold out for 15 days longer, but that the enemy's works were within 25 feet of his redan, and that his men had been 34 days and nights in the trenches without relief, and the enemy within conversation distance. "We are living," he adds, "on very reduced rations." And this gloomy dispatch, Johnston says, was the last received from Pemberton, though others were written. He answered, saying that if the worst should come, Pemberton should himself make overtures of surrender to Grant, as such a step on Johnston's part would be an impolitic confession of weakness. During all these months, a busy and most unsatisfactory correspondence was going on between the Confederate government at Richmond and General Johnston. On the 24th of May, Jefferson Davis expressed to him the not very reasonable hope that he should soon be able to break the investment, make a junction, and carry in munitions. Johnston replied, referring to his inferiority in troops to General Grant, and the controversy as to his numbers continued for several days. In a dispatch of the 5th of June, Mr. Seddon, the Secretary of War, regrets his inability to promise more troops, as we have drained resources even to the danger of several points. Johnston says 5 days later, "I have not at my disposal half the number of troops necessary." At the same time, he does not choose to take the responsibility of withdrawing troops from Bragg. "Nor is it for me," he says, "to judge which it is best to hold, Mississippi or Tennessee. That is for the government to determine. Without some great blunder of the enemy, we cannot hold both. I consider saving Vicksburg hopeless." Mr. Seddon replied in grief and alarm, "Vicksburg must not be lost without a desperate struggle. The interest and honor of the Confederacy forbid it. I rely on you still to avert the loss. If better resources do not offer, you must hazard attack." To this, General Johnston replied in a dispatch which shows how depressed was the tone of his spirits, and how impossible it was for him to see anything but the strength of the enemy and his own weakness. "Grant's position," he says, "naturally very strong, is entrenched and protected by powerful artillery and the roads obstructed. The Big Black covers him from attack and would cut off retreat if defeated. The defeat of this little army would at once open Mississippi and Alabama to Grant." He repeats that he has no hope of doing more than to extricate the garrison. Mr. Seddon, 2 days later, in a tone of vehement persuasion, urged General Johnston to action. With courteous and even flattering language, he invited him to follow the most desperate course the occasion might demand. Rely upon it. The eyes and hopes of the whole Confederacy are upon you, with the fullest confidence that you will act, and with the sentiment that it were better to fail nobly daring than through prudence even to be inactive. I look to attack in the last resort, but rely on your resources of generalship to suggest less desperate modes of relief. Mr. Seddon, in his deep distress, went on to suggest in turn an attack upon Banks, something to be done in cooperation with Kirby Smith, or finally, the setting on foot of siege operations with artillery against Grant from the dry swamps on the north side of the Yazoo below Haynes' Bluff. Johnston, unmoved by these persuasions and passionate appeals, explained on the 24th the utter impossibility of following any of these suggestions, but, unable to withstand the pressure behind him, he at last made ready to move upon Grant's line. He is careful to make it clear that he did not undertake this expedition in the wild spirit that dictated the dispatches from the War Department. He did not expect to save Vicksburg by raising the siege. His utmost hopes, he said, were, in case the chances of success seemed to justify it, to attack the beleaguering line and to rescue the army. With this intention, he devoted the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th of July to an elaborate series of reconnaissances, which showed him that the besieging army was covered by a line of fieldworks extending from the railroad bridge to the Yazoo, that all the roads leading to it had been obstructed, and that strong bodies of Federal troops observed and guarded the river. He therefore determined, he says, to move by the way of Edwards Station to the South Road on the morning of the 5th, and he dispatched a note to General Pemberton telling him that a relieving force was about to attempt a diversion to enable him to cut his way out of the place, and that he hoped to attack the enemy for this object on the 7th. But even before the letter was written, the fate of Pemberton and his army had been decided, and instead of moving upon Vicksburg, Johnston was making the best of his way to Jackson on the 7th of July. In any case, General Johnston's attack would have been too late, for it was the 6th of July that Grant had fixed as the day of his final assault upon Vicksburg. The heads of sap had reached the enemy's line at several points. Grant had fired one heavy mine on the Jackson Road on the 25th of June, exploding almost a ton of powder. Vast masses of earth were thrown into the air. A part of the enemy's parapet was hurled bodily into the Union lines, several Confederate soldiers being thrown in, still living with the flying mass. An attempt was made to hold the crater thus formed, but it was commanded by an inner line, and after severe loss from hand grenades, the Union troops were compelled to abandon it. Another mine was begun with the intention of firing it when the final assault was made, but the Confederate miners being hard at work very near it, it was thought injudicious to wait, and on the 1st of July, the mine was loaded and fired, again destroying a redan of the enemy, crushing his galleries, and disabling about 25 men. The Union troops were deterred by the experience of the 25th of June from attempting to occupy this crater. The approaches were now in several places within a few feet of the enemy's works. Every advance of a single yard resulted in a hand-to-hand contest between the troops of the two armies. No further progress could be made by digging alone. The enemy's works were everywhere weakened. At as many as 10 different points, Grant was able to put heads of regiments under cover within from 5 to 100 yards of the enemy's line. There was little more to be done. No further delay could avail. Vicksburg was a ripe fruit, only waiting to be plucked, and Grant had fixed the hour of plucking 3 days ahead. Within the city, the state of affairs had come to a point where much longer resistance was impossible. Absolute famine had not yet made its appearance, but the stock of provisions was dwindling fast, and prices had risen portentously. They were estimated, it is true, in Confederate money, but as the people had no other measure of value, even these fictitious prices give some idea of the general distress. Flour was $1,000 a barrel, meal $140 a bushel. It was difficult to get a gallon of molasses for $10. The oxen killed by the shells of the bombardment were picked up by butchers and the meat sold for $2 and $3 a pound. The pack mules, which early in the siege had been driven outside the rebel forces to forage for themselves, were now enticed inside or caught by parties in the night, and furnished the subsistence of thousands of troops and citizens. The unhappy people of Vicksburg passed their nights and a great part of their days in caves excavated in the hillsides. These troglodyte habitations became an article of commerce, selling for $40 and $50 each. There was still a large army within the walls, and they were not yet destitute of military stores. The most serious deficiency was that which began to declare itself in the morale of the troops. The Confederates seemed to have lost confidence in their leaders and all hope of a favorable issue of the siege. Conversation between the pickets of the opposing forces became general and was encouraged by Grant, as the advantage was all upon his side. Late in the siege, the rebel pickets communicated a rumor current in the city that the place was to be evacuated by night, that the garrison was to be transferred across the Mississippi, and that houses were being torn down all over the city for the purpose of constructing boats to effect this passage. They also said that there was a disposition among the troops to mutiny if they were called on to cut their way out. Among General Pemberton's papers, communications have been found from private soldiers warning him of the ominous tone of discontent in his army. Held by the relentless embrace of a host he now considered invincible, and despairing at last of any relief from the outside, Pemberton, on the 1st of July, requested his division commanders to give him their opinion in writing as to the ability of their troops to make the marches and undergo the fatigues necessary to accomplish a successful evacuation. Forney, Smith, and Bowen at once replied, advising capitulation. Stevenson's opinion was a little more encouraging. Pemberton then called them together, and the council unanimously resolved upon capitulation. General Bowen was sent with a flag of truce to Grant on the morning of the 3rd, proposing the appointment of commissioners to arrange terms of surrender. As the matter was resolved upon, Pemberton thought best to lose no time, and as he was afterwards severely blamed for giving to the Union arms the glory of a great victory upon the national anniversary, he replied that he had selected the day for the surrender, hoping for better terms through this gratification of the national pride. To Bowen's embassy, Grant replied that the only terms he would admit were those of unconditional surrender. Bowen, being a friend of Grant's and an old neighbor in Missouri, asked for a personal interview. This Grant declined, but consented to meet Pemberton in front of the lines at 3 o'clock. In the afternoon, under a tree standing alone upon the hillside, a few hundred yards from the rebel lines, the commanders of the two armies met. Pemberton, being accompanied by General Bowen and General L. M. Montgomery, and Grant by Ord and McPherson, Logan, and A.J. Smith. It was a picture full of vivid and exciting interest to the troops of the two armies, who swarmed upon the parapets of the opposing lines in eager expectation and perfect security, in places where their exposure a few hours before would have been certain death. A strange and almost oppressive silence, unbroken by a single shot from the earthworks or the fleet, brooded over the scene, wrapped in the warm languor of a sultry summer evening. The two generals saluted each other, and Pemberton asked what terms of capitulation he was to expect. Grant repeated what he had said in the morning. Pemberton haughtily replied, "Then the conference may as well terminate." And in this futile manner, the meeting was on the point of breaking up, when General Bowen suggested that a conference between two of the subordinates might lead to some result. Grant neither assented nor objected to this, and Smith and Bowen retired a little way, leaving Pemberton and Grant in conversation. A few minutes later, the two subordinates returned, and Bowen suggested that the Confederates should march out of Vicksburg with the honors of war. Grant promptly and smilingly rejected the proposition. Without coming to any conclusion, the generals separated, Grant promising to send his ultimatum before 10 o'clock at night, the truce to last as long as the correspondence should be in progress. Grant returned to his camp and sent to Pemberton the following letter. In conformity with agreement of this afternoon, I will submit the following proposition for the surrender of the city of Vicksburg, public stores, etc. On your accepting the terms proposed, I will march in one division as a guard and take possession at 8 a.m. tomorrow. As soon as rolls can be made out and paroles signed by officers and men, you will be allowed to march out of our lines, the officers taking with them their sidearms and clothing, and the field, staff, and cavalry officers 1 horse each. The rank and file will be allowed all their clothing but no other property. If these conditions are accepted, any amount of rations you may deem necessary can be taken from the stores you now have, and also the necessary cooking utensils for preparing them. 30 wagons also, counting 2 two-horse or mule teams as one, will be allowed to transport such articles as cannot be carried along. The same conditions will be allowed to all sick and wounded officers and soldiers as fast as they become able to travel. The paroles for these latter must be signed, however, while officers are present authorized to sign the roll of prisoners. Late at night, Pemberton replied, accepting these terms in the main, but in justice both to the honor and spirit of his troops manifested in the defense of Vicksburg, he proposed, by way of amendment, to evacuate the works in and around Vicksburg and to surrender the city and garrison under his command by marching out with his colors and arms and stacking them in front of his present lines, after which Grant should take possession. He asked also that his officers retain their sidearms and personal property, and the rights and property of citizens should be respected. Shortly after midnight, Grant sent his final answer, acceding only partly to Pemberton's proposed amendment. It will be necessary, Grant said, to furnish every officer and man with a parole signed by himself, which, with the completion of the rolls of prisoners, will necessarily take some time. Again, I can make no stipulations with regard to the treatment of citizens and their private property. While I do not propose to cause them any undue annoyance or loss, I cannot consent to leave myself under any restraint by stipulations. The property which officers will be allowed to take with them will be as stated in my proposition of last evening, that is, officers will be allowed their private baggage and sidearms, and mounted officers 1 horse each. If you mean by your proposition for each brigade to march to the front of the lines now occupied by it, and to stack arms at 10 o'clock a.m., and then return to the inside and there remain as prisoners until properly paroled, I will make no objections to it. Should no notification be received of your acceptance of my terms by 9 a.m., I shall regard them as having been rejected and shall act accordingly. Should these terms be accepted, white flags should be displayed along your lines to prevent such of my troops as may not have been notified from firing upon your men. These terms were accepted by Pemberton. The last shot had been fired on the heights of Vicksburg. At 10 o'clock on the morning of the 4th of July, the Union soldiers, standing upon the parapets of their works, witnessed with deep emotion the army of the Confederates issuing from their sally ports, stacking their arms in front of the works which they had defended so long and so gallantly, and retiring again within their lines as prisoners of war. They were so near together that every word spoken on one side could easily be heard on the other. And it is not the least of the glories gained by the Army of the Tennessee in this wonderful campaign that not a cheer went up from the Union ranks, not a single word said that could offend their beaten foes. Logan's command, which was nearest to the works, had the merited honor of marching first into Vicksburg. The soldiers of the two armies immediately began to fraternize, and the Northern boys shared the contents of their well-filled haversacks with their hungry brethren of the South. In the higher ranks, this fraternization was not so prompt. General Grant was received by Pemberton and his staff at headquarters with sulky coldness. No one, at first, offered him a seat. When he asked for a drink of water, he was told where he might find it himself. And during the interview between the two generals, which lasted half an hour, Grant remained standing, while officers, girded with the swords which his magnanimity had allowed them to retain, sat sullenly about him. General Pemberton asked for supplies to feed his troops. Grant asked him how many rations would be required, and, to his amazement, Pemberton replied 32,000. for from these words the conqueror gained the first intelligence of the magnitude of his triumph. With his habit of minimizing the number of his enemy, he had thought, up to this moment, that he had captured less than 20,000 men. He rode down to the wharf and exchanged congratulations with Porter, who had rendered him such manful assistance through evil and good report during the last year, and then went back through the cheering lines of his troops to his old quarters in the camp beyond Vicksburg. The paroling of the troops was rapidly accomplished, and they marched away on the 11th of July, Pemberton vainly imploring the assistance of Grant to keep them in their ranks. The disposition to desert was so general that he feared he could not bring his army intact to its destination. This was, of course, refused. General Grant always afterwards, in his reports and in his memoirs, showed an unwonted anxiety to defend his action in thus paroling Pemberton's army. Immediately on receiving the news of the great victory, General Halleck had suggested to him that this action might be construed into an absolute release, and the men be put at once into the ranks of the enemy, such having been the action of the Confederates elsewhere. Grant's defense of this proceeding was that he saved thereby several days in the capture, and left the troops and the transports ready for other service. But it must be counted on the whole an error of judgment, for even before Pemberton, with his unarmed host, had marched away from Vicksburg, Jefferson Davis had telegraphed to him that all the general officers had been exchanged and were released from their parole, and 2 months later the Confederate agent of exchange notified the United States agent that all the effective troops paroled at Vicksburg were declared exchanged and ordered to duty. In spite of the protests on the part of the national authorities, this lawless proceeding was carried through, and Grant confronted, a few months later, on the heights of the Chattanooga, some of the soldiers to whom he had allowed such generous terms on the bluffs of Vicksburg. The confusion arising from this lasted till the end of the war, and it was due to General Grant's belief that the Confederate authorities had acted in bad faith in this matter that he maintained so rigid an attitude in regard to the exchange of prisoners during the last year of the war. On the other hand, during the march of the paroled Confederates to Demopolis, the place where they were to await their exchange, some of the results which General Grant looked forward to became apparent. Grant, having refused Pemberton the means of maintaining order among his demoralized troops, the gravest indications of a mutinous spirit appeared as soon as they left Vicksburg, and continually increased as they moved along the hot and dusty roads. They insulted their officers, and at one time loudly called upon Pemberton to come and be hanged. All along their route they scattered the germs of discouragement and discontent. But the victory was too great, too important, and too beneficent for criticism. Seldom in the history of the world have results so vast been attained with equal expenditure. Grant had captured 29,491 men, 172 cannon, 60,000 muskets, generally new arms which had recently run the blockade, and which were at once adopted by the regiments of our army in exchange for their own inferior pieces battered with use and associated with many victories. General Pemberton's returns for March showed 61,495 actually present, and of these all that remained saved from death, wounds, or capture on the 4th of July were those who had escaped with Loring from Champion's Hill, and 11,000 or 12,000 more who were in the force which Sherman was chasing before him towards Jackson. The Confederate cause had lost not much less than 50,000 supporters in this destructive campaign, and with them the control of that great artery of the West, the Mississippi River. The Confederacy was cut in two at a cost to the Union of 9,362 men. There were still 2 years of labor and toil and bloodshed before the end came, but the war reached its crisis, and the fate of the rebellion was no longer doubtful from that hour, in the afternoon of the 3rd of July, when Grant and Pemberton sat in stern and joyless conversation beneath the oak tree on the hillside of Vicksburg, and Pickett's veterans were reeling back, baffled and broken by the guns of Meade at Gettysburg. End of chapter 10.